Talked about this last time, and the part about the naked women is not on the tape. Performance enhancing drugs came into the fore in the 1960s and 1970s, along with amphetamines and all the rest of the stuff. What happened was before World War II. Sports were pretty much for wealthy people and for really good people that were really good at it. And that's one of the reasons why all those records have been just smashed, because we weren't really trying that hard. Nobody was. The Olympics were not for really good runners or really good athletes. It was for the wealthy people, and that's one of the reasons why there is a concept of amateur status, and there was until the 21st century. With the Cold War, after World War II, the world was split in two political philosophies. One of them had to do with a more democratic form of government. The other had to do with communism. Communism wanted to show that they were superior. So one of the ways that they showed that they were superior was by winning as frequently as possible. One of the things they discovered, of course, was that if they used performance-enhancing drugs, they could win all the races. They could win all the swim meets. So this is the way it looked. This is what people looked like when they were swimmers in the 1920s. That's Johnny Weissmuller, who eventually became Tarzan in the movies. And of course, this is after people started using steroids, as lovely as that is.
But with a guy that big, does he really have strength? Or is it just
he's got gym strength. I don't know what else you could do with those muscles. It looks, he likes the way he looks, I'm assuming. Look how large, his arms are bigger than my legs.
He's like, can he whip his legs on?
Well, he's not functional. Most of his muscle mass is non-functional, as strange as that is. Eastern Bloc countries, led by the example of East Germany, began giving their athletes anabolic steroids, and this created super athletes. This is a female shot putter. This is her as a transgender person because the steroids really messed up her sexuality to the extent that she was no longer female. So now she is a male. Now he is a male.
How much is the ball weigh?
The shot put?
Yeah.
I think that's a 12-pound shot.
And that event, you throw it by distance?
Yeah. You put it. It's kind of like throwing a hand grenade. You can't rear back and throw it like this. You have to throw it like this.
Here's a technique. You like kind of skip and then you lunge it.
Yeah, you push your arm forward. So you try to get all your momentum going with your putting. And you're putting the ball. Yeah, it's a 12-pound shot. High school they throw 8-pound shot, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so we had lots of problems. Okay. Performance-enhancing drugs really screwed up a lot. One of the things that happens to you when you take performance-enhancing drugs, if you take anabolic steroids, it's a testosterone. It's a synthetic testosterone. So what happens is your testicles stop making. I'm sorry, I'm talking to Scott now. Your testicles stop making testosterone. So normally what happens if somebody takes a lot of steroids, their testicles stop producing testosterone and all of their sexual parts shrink because they're not being functional anymore. They don't need them anymore. So he doesn't really turn into a female. What happens is his sexual parts shrink and he gets a high-pitched voice. This is what happened to Mike Tyson. He had a really high-pitched voice when he was boxing. He was taking steroids. Are steroids illegal for boxers? No, they're not. But he was taking steroids, and so his voice got really, really high. Now that he's not boxing anymore, and now that he's not on steroids, he stopped taking steroids, and his voice has gotten deeper. Real interesting guy. It also makes you, what's the word I'm looking for? It gives you roid rage. At one point, he was at a beauty contest, and he was invited up to somebody's room, and he raped her because of the roid rage and whatnot. Anyway,
He got road rage when he bit Holyfield in.
probably, yeah. I remember that. I was watching that boxing
Man,
match.
I
That
was all like, are you serious?
Yeah, exactly. How stupid is that? Sedatives have been used since the beginning of the 20th century in the form of bromides, chloral hydrate, and paraldehyde. Chloral hydrate is really kind of an interesting chemical structure. It's 3 molecules of alcohol stuck together. So if you take chloral hydrate, it's an instantaneous drunk, and it'll knock you out. And that's what they used to use as Mickey Fins back in the day, to knock people out so that they could Shanghai them as sailors. So somebody would go into a bar, they'd drop a Mickey Fin on them, they'd drop the chloral hydrate, and of course they'd pass out, and then they just haul them off to the ship, and they would Shanghai them. Barbitol was marketed as Veronal in 1903. Phenobarbital was developed in 1913. These are all used as sedatives to knock you out. Sedatives became very popular during the Depression and World War II eras, peaking in this time period with over 50 different barbiturates dominating the market. In the 1950s, doctors realized that they had not only overprescribed the drugs, just like we just realized that we overprescribed opiates, but they had created a whole generation of addicted adults. So sedatives are highly addictive. And here we had all these people hung up on all the barbiturates and whatnot. We also had them hung up on things like Valium. We didn't think the Valium was addictive. Come on, it's a medicine. How could it possibly be addictive? But as it turned out, it was. And we had lots and lots of really serious problems. So doctors made a mistake. They made a mistake when they started giving more and more pills for pain relief. And now we've got a really serious opiate problem in the United States. In the 1950s and 1960s, a whole group of milder tranquilizers were developed to replace the more dangerous tranquilizers. Miltown, benzodiazepines such as Librium, Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, and Halcyon became the most widely used drugs in the world. And they were the most widely used drugs until they invented Prozac. And then Prozac became the most popular drug in the world, or most highly used drug in the world. Right now, strangely enough, the most widely used drug in the world, women don't even use it. But it's still the most widely used drug in the world. It's Viagra. It's the most widely used drug in the world, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because Viagra is for people with erectile dysfunction. How can there possibly be that many people in the world who need an erectile dysfunction medication?
Because it takes steroids.
It doesn't taste good.
What's Klonopin?
Klonopin is it's another benzodiazepine. They use it for individuals with high levels of anxiety.
Okay, because the VA was on.
They gave you Klonopin. How
I don't know, they
did it zone you out?
Little bit, felt like a zombie kind of walking around.
Sure.
I knew what was going on, but it was like,
You were
the
very.
next thing was going real slow.
This is these two are very powerful drugs, extremely powerful drugs. I thought they were only using them as antipsychotics, but then I found out they were using them for people with panic attacks and anxiety problems. When this stuff first came out, they told us not to use it for individuals for depression and for anxiety. This isn't a common drug. This is your last ditch effort to control it.
She said, looked at my record when I was active duty, and I mean, seriously, they had me at one time, like 8, 9 different pills at one time.
And you were on active duty.
Mm-hmm.
Jeez, that doesn't make any. See, in my day, if you were on any pills at all, they would have taken you off. They would have put you in an office someplace.
But what they,
And then they would have boarded you out of the service. But
They
that's in
did.
my day.
They put me at 5 East, which is that certain part of the hospital. you know?
Right.
And that's the first time they gave me trazodone. First time I slept for 13 hours straight. And I don't know.
See, that's what trazodone does. Trazodone makes you jump over your delta wave sleep so that you don't dream. So evidently you're having problems with PTSD. Yeah, okay.
But yeah, I just wonder what Calamity was.
Jeez.
I see it with my name on it.
Ergot, or barley rust, had created havoc wherever it appeared, and no one knew why until the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann isolated the active ingredient in ergot, and that turns out to be lysergic acid diethylamide, also known as LSD. So it's actually in the rust, in this fungus, is lysergic acid diethylamide. After his discovery, Hoffman accidentally dosed himself and discovered the psychedelic effects of the substance. This is not very hard to accidentally dose yourself. He splashed a drop into his eye, and then he took a trip for about 8 hours.
Oh, no.
I know.
Dang.
Well, I don't know if you understand how LSD works, but if we all dropped acid right now, you probably wouldn't have a reaction until after class was
These
over,
walls would be melting.
which isn't a bad idea anyway.
So
Melt the walls.
So LSD is a fungus, or it comes from a fungus?
Comes from a fungus, but LSD is the active ingredient that causes the psychedelic effects, the hallucinations.
Oh, okay.
It's not like you can just go chewing on fungus and all of a sudden, yeah.
Tripping out.
Yeah, eventually you're going to find something that's poison.
Hmm.
The United States Army and the CIA bought the rights to LSD from Hoffman and experimented with the drug through the 1950s and into the 1960s. One of the researchers working with the CIA was Dr. Timothy Leary of Harvard University. He decided that the psychedelic substance needed to be shared with the rest of the world, and the rest is history. Now, well, LSD was real popular in the 60s and 70s. And the reason it was really popular was because people were, I can't remember what they used to say, but they were really popular. It was really popular with the hippies. 1.5 billion people drink alcohol around the world. 76 million of these people have an alcohol abuse disorder. It's a lot of people. There's a lot of people on this reservation. Among the indigenous peoples of the Americas, there's a lot of individuals that have a problem with alcohol. But as I told you last time, Europeans are professional drinkers. They've been doing it for thousands of years. You guys have been doing it for 400. You're just mere amateurs. Haven't quite figured it out yet. 180 million people worldwide abuse illicit drugs. Most of them have to do with opiates. 160 million people worldwide smoke marijuana each year. That is a blunt. It's like a cigar. It has been estimated, and this is the part that irritates me the most, working in medicine. You get these people coming in, and of course they've got all these medical problems. Well, most of them are caused because they were either smoking, drinking, or taking drugs. And so they're the ones that are occupying all of our hospital beds. 20 to 60% of all hospital beds are inhabited by people due to drug abuse of one ilk or another, usually alcohol. But now, of course, it's opiates and methamphetamines and whatnot. Illicit drugs figure into the economic structures both where they are grown and where they are used. Any place where you grow heroin, it's a huge part of the economy. Cocaine's the same way. Marijuana, of course, has been fueling the agricultural economy in California for decades. MDMA ecstasy is a chemical structure. It's relatively easy to make. Methamphetamine, also, you can make it in a plastic Coke container. Shake and bake. The The Mexican police force, Federales, captured $7.5 billion worth of methamphetamine that they were trying to smuggle into the United States. $7.5 billion worth. Illegal heroin is grown in 4 areas of the world, and by golly, it seems like we just keep getting involved in these areas. The Golden Crescent is an area in Southwest Asia that encompasses areas of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, and this is where they grow heroin. It's high-grade heroin. It is where heroin first, they first started growing opium in this area, and then it spread, and then it contracted, and now right there in Afghanistan. Well, my brother was in Afghanistan. He was in Afghanistan in 2005. He was in a province that where they grew a lot of opium, and he convinced them to stop growing opium and only market it to, not market it illicitly. That's what he convinced them to do. But he was, my family's not very religious. He didn't really care. I guess he is probably a Christian, but he doesn't proselytize. He doesn't preach. The guy that took over for him was an evangelist, and of course their mission in life is to convince people to become Christians. Oh my God. They wouldn't leave the Muslims alone. And because of that, they got pissed off and they started selling. They had whole warehouses full of opium, and they sold it to make
A
heroin.
lot of the fields are in the Hemland region.
That's where he was.
I've guarded
Fields of opium.
there. Yeah, I'm just like, are you
Opium
fucking
poppies.
serious?
I got a picture of people guarding opium poppies. That's not the only place. Of course, there's 4 different areas. One of them is in the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, right where we are right now. The Golden Triangle encompasses parts of Southeast Asia, countries of Thailand, Myanmar, which used to be Burma, and Laos. And of course, this is known as the Golden Triangle. And we were in Vietnam, of course, and then we invaded Cambodia. Cambodia's down here. We invaded Cambodia. We had allies in Thailand. Well, right in this whole area is where all the opium is being grown. Thai sticks and whatnot. It was a mess. It was just a huge mess. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The third area is in Mexico. Their heroin, their opium, for some reason it's dark. It comes out brown rather than white. And this stuff they call black tar or brown heroin. It's not as strong as white heroin. It's not as pure. But you can, if you're looking for pure heroin, their heroin comes out of the opium is also grown in Colombia. Colombia not only exports cocaine to the United States, but a white heroin as well. It's a very strong heroin. White heroin found in the Golden Triangle, Golden Crescent in Colombia is pure, it's stronger, and that will get you high a lot faster than the brown heroin. Brown heroin is, well, don't let me talk about brown heroin. There you go, there's somebody guarding opium poppies. 90% of the world's supply of illicit heroin comes from the poppy fields of Afghanistan, despite the fact we're there. 60% of Afghanistan's wealth comes from opium sales, and the United States' efforts to curb production has resulted in an increase of 50%. In other words, we're trying to control it, but instead of controlling it, it's exploding. And one of the reasons is because they're pissed off at us because of all the evangelists harassing them about changing their religion. And it pisses them off.
So it's payback.
Yeah, kinda. Yeah, they're just not gonna do what we say, mainly because we harass them about their religion, and they don't like that. They're really serious about their religion.
Yeah. Is that heroin, what they're guarding, or?
They're guarding opium poppies. These are opium poppies. As soon as it comes to head, you can cut the head in several places, and a exudate comes out, a white exudate comes out. And then they'll scrape that up, and they will, and then they purify it. That's opium, that's what opium is.
They're pretty.
Comes out of the head of the flower. As weird as that is.
I was thinking something else, like you guys said they're guarding it. I'm thinking like desert fields or something, but and then here I get flowers.
Yeah, they're flowers. It's the opium poppy. Poppy is a flower. And this is when it's just flowering. And what they'll do is they'll pull the flower off so that it will come to a head. And that is the reproductive organ. And then they will split it so that they can get the juice out of it. They have to let it, they can't just pull it off and squeeze it, because if they did that, it would kill the plant. And then they wouldn't have a plant for next year. So instead of doing that, they cut it, and they are able to get the exudate to come out. And then it's good for next year. They have to leave some in there, of course. So when we're talking about geopolitics, and when we're talking about wars, especially in Asia, we're talking about, you can't get away from opium. You just can't do it. The Nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang party dealt with drug tongs of Shanghai while they controlled China. In other words, they were in cahoots with them. And so they were selling all these drugs all over the world. And this was a government. This is the nationalist government. This is like Trump deciding he's going to go into selling cocaine. So he makes a deal with the, I don't know, who's he going to make it? Or he's going to sell crystal meth. So he makes a deal with meth manufacturers, and he agrees that he's not going to bust them if they give him 20% of the profits.
That sounds like something you would do.
Yeah, it sounds like something he would, yeah. That's what the Chinese government was doing. At one point after World War II, Chiang Kai-shek was China. He fought a civil war against the communists and lost. And of course, then he moved to Taiwan. Then the Chinese government moved to Taiwan. But this was a government that we were supporting as Americans. And the government, of course, was being financed with drug money out of Shanghai. After the Kuomintang were expelled from China, they continued to grow and market opium along the Thai-Burma border in order to buy weapons for their defense against the communists. So despite the fact that they were no longer in charge, they were growing opium in another area. That was in the Golden Crescent, or the Golden Triangle.
They were from China, but then
They were the Chinese government.
they were Chinese communists.
They are now, sure,
Okay.
because the communists kicked them out.
But back then, it wasn't.
They were the government. They were the people we were talking to. And they were still growing drugs along the Taiwan border. The Chinese government was. Now here's my war. Okay, that was World War II. This is Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a mess. It was just a huge, huge mess. Not only was the war being fought in the Golden Triangle, but the United States allied itself with some of the most notorious drug smugglers in the area, the Hmong. And if you know anything about the Hmong, if you've ever heard about the Hmong, they are here. They are with us.
My neighbor I grew up, they actually have a gang.
Hmong, these guys are vicious. They'll cut your,
one guy, Southsiders and Bloods don't get along. One guy came at us with a freaking machete. I was like, oh, man.
That's crazy. These guys will smile and slit your throat at the same time. They were just the most. There were two.
What do they consider? They're not loud. Well, actually, they don't like the Laos.
Laotians?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were some Crips. Well, besides Crips and Bloods, but like if you call them Vietnamese or something like that, they get pissed.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, they're not.
But I mean,
They look completely
is
different.
it its own thing or what?
Well, the
Own
Hmong, the Hmongs are a tribe. They're a mountain tribe. In Vietnam or anywhere you go, There were the people that lived in the valleys, and they were usually the ones that had all the money. And then they forced all the indigenous peoples, the mountain tribes, they forced them up into the mountains. And the Hmong were one of the mountain tribes, as were the Ho. There's two groups of drug smugglers that we used, and we used them as soldiers. We wanted them to ambush the North Vietnamese supply lines, and they did. They were really good at it. They hated the Viet Cong. They hated the Vietnamese. They hated the valley people because they were mountain people. So we allied ourselves with all the mountain tribes. I'm trying to think who the mountain tribes were in Vietnam. Wait a minute. It hasn't. Anyway, we allied ourselves to the mountain tribes because these guys were really good guerrilla fighters. They had been guerrilla fighters all their. It's kind of like what we did with the Kurds. We allied ourselves to the Kurds because they'd been fighting against the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Iranians. They'd been fighting them forever. So they were really good at it.
With the Philippine people?
I'm sorry?
Philippine were good guerrilla warfighters too in World War II.
Yeah, but, yeah. Exactly, yeah, and we allied ourselves with the mountain tribes. We allied ourselves with the people that lived outside the city. I'm trying to think of the groups in the.
But yeah, as far as, at least in my neighborhood, they're a pretty scandalous group, man.
Yeah, these are some scary, and they're not very big people. I mean.
No, they're small, they're freaking skinny as hell,
Yeah,
but they'll put a gun in you
they
quick.
will slit your
Or a
throat.
machete. I was like, what the hell?
So the Hmong,
Hmong.
the Hmong, that's where that whole color war started or something?
No, didn't start with these guys. No, the Bloods and the Crips.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
That
was.
started in the United States.
That's
Chicago.
old.
Is that
and
just
LA.
like an interpretation of them or something?
No, that's just, the different
that?
races have, or can be.
Yeah, or different groups. Yeah.
Different can be, like, most people have, black people are like Bloods and Crips. In San Diego, you got Hmongs, Samoans, Laos. There's a Filipino gang called Bahina. It's
it's a mess.
the world of gangs is just crazy.
Okay.
Los Angeles is the same way. They have Vietnamese gangs, and they have Armenian gangs, and they have Hispanic gangs, just all kinds of gangs. And then, of course, the Bloods and the Crips are down there as well. The Hmongs were excellent allies against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong as they moved freely through Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, and they fought the communist soldiers who encroached in the area. Then when the war ended, we brought a bunch of them over here because they had been our allies. So there's Hos and there are Hmongs in the United States. There's a whole community of them, obviously in San Diego, but there's also a community of them in Detroit. That's what Gran Torino, if you've ever seen the movie Gran Torino.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, those guys are Hmongs, the people that they're dealing with. There was a Hmong that was hunting, and he was hunting with a AK-47. This is up in Minnesota. There's a bunch of them in Minneapolis, and these guys gave him a hard time. These other hunters, he hunted them all down and killed them, and there were 7 of them, just him against 7 hunters, deer hunters, and they gave him a hard time. They beat him up or something, and he just got pissed, and he killed them all. He didn't shoot them, he stabbed them, he cut them up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, only one guy survived out of the 7, and he was the one, they had spotted them, they were trying to catch the deer in a certain crescent, and he just knocked them off one by one.
Yeah.
And they were trying to decide what to do. They called it a race problem. Cocaine doesn't grow just anywhere. Cocaine grows mainly in the humid mountain valleys of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. It's not like you guys could start growing cocaine here. It's not humid enough. There's not enough water. Cocaine has been at the forefront of the political problems in Colombia for over half a century. Drug cartels operate with impunity throughout the country and control many of the decisions being made locally and nationally. And that's one of the reasons why Colombia is an outlaw country, because it's being controlled by drug lords. Worldwide, 25 million people have died from AIDS, and another 40 million are infected with HIV. 25 million, that's the size of Texas and Montana put together. 40 million, that's the size of the population of California and Oregon put together. In the United States, around 900,000, that's the population of Montana, are infected with HIV, while 500,000, the population of Seattle, have died of AIDS. So the United States is not as serious as it is in some places in the world. It's still serious. All these children have AIDS. This child is dying from AIDS, unfortunately. When the AIDS epidemic first hit in 1982, 1983, I was working in medicine at the time. It was mostly caused by unsafe sex between homosexual males. We started recognizing it in the bathhouses of New York and San Francisco. It seemed to spread just among homosexuals. So there were a lot of people in the United States, evangelical Christians, who decided that it was punishment for homosexuality. So they didn't want to do anything about it. This is in 82, 83. It wasn't until 1985 that we started a task force in the United States to fight against AIDS. And the reason we did, we weren't doing that is because at the time Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, his government was fairly conservative, and since evangelicals were a large part of his voting population, he didn't want, they said that it was a punishment for the gay community, and he didn't want to do anything with it because of politics. But finally, in 1985, something happened. And what happened was Rock Hudson died of AIDS. And of course, Ronald Reagan was an actor. He was a friend of Rock Hudson's. Rock Hudson was a special friend of Nancy Reagan, Reagan's wife. And after that, of course, they became a little bit more responsible for what was going on. We had no clue what was going on. The only way you can figure this out is by doing research. And of course, we hadn't funded any research. At this point, we still didn't know. We still had no clue what AIDS was. We didn't know if it's a virus. We didn't know if it's a retrovirus. We didn't know how in the world it infected people. But finally, in 1985, after we started about 84, we finally discovered what was going on. Now the problem is that before that we had no way of knowing if somebody had AIDS or not. We didn't have any way of detecting it. The only way we knew is if they were dying of AIDS. We didn't know how to check for it in blood. 1985 I ruptured my spleen. Somebody ruptured my spleen. Anyway, my spleen got ruptured and I had to have surgery, and they gave me 6 units of blood. This is before they knew how to figure out whether the blood was tainted with AIDS. And I got 6 units of blood. So for the next, what is this, this is 2020. So ever since then, every time I go to see the doctor, he always gives me a test for AIDS. Because in the beginning they said the window was only 5 years. If you haven't developed AIDS in 5 years, then you don't have it. Then they realized, wait a minute, it can stay in your system for 10 years. So 10 years after I got my blood, my 6 units of blood, 1985, by 1995, they had decided, wait a minute, it can stay in your system for 20 years. So every time I go see the doctor, they always check me to make sure I don't have AIDS. I've never had it. I've never been AIDS positive.
But still, you're probably like thinking about it.
Well, I'm 70 years old by this time. I'm going.
I mean, like before, when you got the blood.
Oh yeah, 1985. They're scaring the shit out of me.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of strange, but I figured, I'll just stay healthy, and I probably won't have to worry about it. Maybe I can just fight it off. But of course, I've never had a positive test. So they had no clue. They thought it had something to do with homosexuality. Well, it doesn't have anything to do with homosexuality. It has to do with blood, because AIDS is in your white cells. It's in a special type of white cell, your T cells. It infects your T cells. In time, it spread into the intravenous drug injecting population, and now it is more likely to be contracted by sharing contaminated needles than any other cause. It's in the heterosexual community as well. And initially, it only had to do with...
That's how my uncle died.
Your uncle died of AIDS?
Yeah, he used to fuck a lot with Miss Brown.
Was he gay, or was he
No,
an intravenous?
He was
drug?
slamming, he was a slammer.
He's a slammer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know, just like, my mom, she's just like, man, you're losing a lot of weight. And I think maybe 3-4 years, he used to live in a trailer, you know, and they found him with I'm not sure if it was because he was already HIV positive, I'm not sure if it was AIDS or he had a hot shot.
Right.
But they found him in a pool of his own blood and with the shit in his arm.
That's the way it works. That's how you inject, if you ever want to inject drugs.
So how was AIDS invented? Or is it just something?
Where'd it come from?
Yeah.
I think it came from the monkey virus, from a monkey virus.
Somebody did the nasty with the monkey, was it?
Potentially, but probably what happened was they just ate it.
They ate it? I heard that story, and that's what everybody's been
I
telling
don't know, I've had monkey brain.
Yeah, well, I mean, people eat, in Africa, they eat what they call bush meat. They'll eat any meat that comes out of the jungle. They say it's better, you know, they mix it all together, but they eat monkey, okay? So they think that's where it came from. Or somebody had sex with a monkey. I mean, that's a possibility.
But perfect example, Eazy-E, right? Eric Red. From the time that he got it, from the time that he died, it was too fucking quick.
Oh,
Someone had to have injected it with it.
I don't think so.
No, it was too quick, there's no way.
No,
There's no
the thing
fucking
about
way.
AIDS is, if you're immunocompromised, it's gonna kill you quick. So if you're using other drugs, then probably what's going to happen is that if you're using drugs, then you're probably immunocompromised. How in the world is it like
No, it's too damn quick.
that? Now it's not there, okay. There we go, okay. Anyway, so AIDS isn't the only problem that you could potentially have. When I was working in medicine, hardly anybody had hepatitis C. All of a sudden, it just exploded. Anybody using intravenous drug users, they all developed hepatitis C. And what was going on was, one guy was infected with it, and they just kept swapping needles back and forth. So now, in order to protect people, we have the drug trade-in system where you take your needle trade-in system, and we give them fresh needles so that they don't develop hepatitis C, syphilis, or AIDS. Hepatitis C is a liver infection that infects about 4 million Americans. That's the population of Los Angeles. That doesn't mean everybody in Los Angeles has it. That means a lot of people have it. 85 to 90% of all intravenous drug users are infected with HCV, mostly because they share their needles, which is a really dumb thing to do. Okay, so we've been cool for a really, really long time. In the 1920s, it seems like cool things are mixed with the music of the time. In the Roaring 20s, of course, people were mixing the coolest of music with psychoactive substances. In the 20s, it was cocaine and bootleg liquor, because, of course, it was during Prohibition. The women were called flappers, and they were, as you can see, she's raising her dress up and she's dancing, so you can see her thighs while she's dancing. That's why they called them flappers. And the men were referred to as jazzbos, because they listened to jazz, so they were jazzbos. These are the cool words that we call people. Women were flappers and men were jazzbos. In the 1950s, the music was the blues. This is brand new music. That was the cool music. The drugs were heroin and whiskey. The men and women were either called beats or beatniks. This is in the 1950s. You guys don't know anything about the Beats and Beatniks. We tried to stay away from these people. They didn't really make a lot of movies about them. They didn't even talk about them. If you've ever watched Dobie Gillis, the television show, not the movie, Maynard G. Krebs was a beatnik. He had the beard just like yours. He had the goatee. He always wore a sweatshirt, and he always talked in beat language. It was a certain language that they talk, and of course the guy was played by Bob Denver, strangely enough. Okay, so let's move forward a little bit. In the 1960s and 1970s, the music became hard rock or acid rock. The psychoactive drugs that fueled the music were LSD, speed, marijuana, and wine. The people were hippies and the women were chicks or birds. In England, they were birds. In the United States, they were called chicks, but everybody was hippies. As cool as that is, and everybody grew their hair as long as they possibly could and lived in communes, which is always fun. As we drifted into the new millennium, the music became techno or electronic trance music. The psychoactive drugs that fueled the craze were MDMA, marijuana, nitrous oxide, ketamine, GHB, and beer. Now, the interesting thing about ketamine and GHB is that those are also date rape drugs. Special K. Anyway.
Yeah, those were popular in the 90s.
Yeah.
That's my era right there.
That's your era, there you go. Participants were referred to as ravers. I don't think we had special names for boys and girls. They were all just ravers.
There were flyer parties.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They would like, there were these things, back in the 90s, there's a thing called Rebels, right? A lot of dance crews and stuff, mostly Hispanic. And then there were like Rebel girls, and then there were party crews, you know?
Okay.
And they would give out flyers, they ran out like the warehouse. They'd give out flyers like $5 at the door.
Right.
And it would last like 24 hours.
And they'd be at a warehouse. Now, when people were using ecstasy?
Everything.
Everything? Well, ecstasy makes you, how can I explain this? It makes your internal temperature go up. So you have to stay really cool.
I don't know,
Yeah.
I would just go there just to make money and leave.
Well, money's more important than anything else. Marijuana continues to create controversy, legalized in many states for medicinal purposes. People are required to have a prescription for its use if it's, and that's what the situation is in Arizona, of course. Marijuana continues to be the most widely used illegal drug throughout much of the world, including the United States, Canada, Australia, Mexico, and South America. We have research coming out of Canada and New Zealand especially, dealing with what marijuana does to you. They did a longitudinal study with individuals in New Zealand that was 25 years long, and what they discovered was that it lowers your IQ about between 10 and 20 points if you use it before the age of 12. Yeah, as interesting as that is. The destructive effects of tobacco have prompted many countries to try to curb its use. What we have done in the United States is raise the price of a package of cigarettes. When I was, well, I've told you this story. You could buy a carton of cigarettes when I was in the military for $2. You could buy a package of cigarettes for $0.25. Of course, now 20 cigarettes will cost you $5 or $6. Cuba ban, I'm sorry?
More like 8.
It's $8 for a
$8.
package of cigarettes? I don't know, wow, I looked it up just before I came to class.
It all depends on the brand. So you get Camels, right? You know, that's probably about almost $7, $8.
7 or
And
8?
you get like some off-brand, it's like $5. So
Well, I guess it makes sense. The percentage of people using, who are smokers in the United States is down to 14%, 14.2% right now. Cuba bans smoking in public places. Ireland bans smoking in pubs. In many states in the United States, smoking is banned in any public area. And of course, this includes all the places where I live: Iowa, Illinois, Arizona, and Montana. All ban smoking. The only place you can smoke legally inside is Indian casinos. Because, of course, you guys get to make your own
You go to
rules.
Georgia, you can still smoke in the Waffle House,
Okay,
the restaurant.
yeah, I know. I know the Waffle House, yellow and black.
Yep.
There we go. There's Ronnie Reagan selling cigarettes. As late as 1966, almost half the population smoked regularly, 42.6%. Watching old movies this weekend, everybody was smoking, everybody. There was ashtrays everywhere. And that's the way it used to be. There were ashtrays everywhere. You could smoke inside, you could smoke anywhere you wanted, in essence, and everybody smoked. All the women smoked, all the men smoked. 42.6% smoked in 1966. And of course, I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s. Half the population is smoking. And of course, cigarettes were relatively cheap. By 2005, the percentage of regular smokers in the United States had declined to less than 1/4 of the adult population, 22.5%, and now it's at 14%. This decline had much to do with the discovery that cigarettes contain many carcinogens that cause disturbing medical problems, and this is the reason why I tell you that life expectancy for me when I was born was only 56. Well, I'm 70, I'm 14 years beyond that. Why in the world was it 56? Well, the reason was 56 was because most of the people were smoking cigarettes and dying relatively young. There's no reason in the world why I was so interested in people dying, but I used to read the obituaries to find out how old they were. I was trying to figure out how long my parents were going to live. So my mom and dad were in their 40s, and I'm seeing people dying in their 50s. Maybe if they were old, they died in their 60s or 70s, but most people were dying in their 50s. People were dying of lung cancer, and they used to tell you why they died. Died of leukemia, died of lung cancer, died of kidney cancer or whatever. They used to tell you all this stuff. So I used to read the obituaries only to find out how long my parents were going to live. And in the 1950s and 1960s, people were routinely dying in their late 40s, early 50s of cancer. I watched a movie this weekend called Where the Boys Are. One of the stars of the movie was a guy named Jim Hutton. He's really tall, 6'5", died of lung cancer at 45. And of course, he was a child of the 60s, or 50s and 60s as well. Okay, so 1,178 people die every day from the effects of smoking. That's a lot of people. A study in England showed that smoking can reduce your life expectancy by 10 years. And both of my parents lived into their 90s. So me being worried about when they were going to die, if they left together in the same car, I was worried that they would be killed in an automobile accident. A lot of crazy people out there. Okay. I know, maybe I worried.
Are you paranoid?
I know, I was like, dude.
I'm not really paranoid. I just thought, I was just worried about people dying. Of course, then I started working in the hospital. My mother was a nurse. She used to talk about people dying all the time.
Oh.
And then you became
That's where it
paranoid.
started right there.
I didn't really become paranoid. When I started working in the hospital, I started not caring when people died. And when people died of lung cancer, I would do things like, well, it's your own damn fault, you big idiot.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. So I became a lot more callous.
You have to.
Well, yeah, you have to or you don't survive. Despite the reduction of the revenue for tobacco companies in the United States, they have been able to keep profits up by developing foreign markets in the third world. So let's make all these other people addicted to tobacco. In the United States, tobacco manufacturers have tried to sustain their market by targeting females, minorities, and younger smokers. They're doing the same thing with alcohol. They aimed Miller, what is it? MGB? Miller Beer?
MGD.
MGD, that's what it is.
Junior draft.
Yeah, they aimed that at the Hispanic population for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why.
Well, because there's a little joke. It stands for Mexicans getting drunk.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Anyway, they tried to get people Hispanics to buy that special beer for some reason.
get the freaking,
I don't understand. 1998, tobacco companies agreed to pay $246 billion. That's $250 billion over 25 years for their illicit practices in the past. They were lying to the American public. They were making cigarettes more addictive by putting more addictive brands of tobacco into the cigarettes. They were doing this, and they made people addicted to tobacco. These were the illicit practices, and for that reason, they have to pay $250 billion for advertisements, and you'll see them on television from time to time. But all the tobacco companies are paying this. Now, the question is, oh my goodness, they're going to go out of business. And the answer is no, hell no, they're not. They can still sell all their tobacco overseas. That's not a problem. $250 billion is nothing compared to the profits that they made. So they're yeah, chump change, exactly. Worldwide, 33 million people use amphetamines or similar stimulant substances. In the United States, 16,000 meth labs were raided in 2004. I tried to find out statistics more recent than 2004. They're just not out there. But when they bust meth labs, they're busting.
I can tell you a lot of them are at though, California.
I'll show you exactly where they are.
There's a lot of 81s out there, and a lot of, well, the Mexican gangs, because that's the Mexican mafia right there, but a lot of like Hells Angels, the Vagos, the Banditos, and the Mongols,
Right.
all operate in California. It's one of their biggest freaking things, is meth.
Oddly enough, a lot of meth is coming across the border.
Really?
Yeah, I told you about the $7.5 billion drug bust they made. Their drug busts along the border are just massive. Meth labs have been partially controlled by controlling the precursor chemicals ephedrine and pseudoephedrine found in common cold remedies. Now you can't just go and buy all these cold remedies anymore. Here's where most of them are. As weird as this is, the tiny state, which isn't that tiny, 1,471, I know, that's Indiana, it's my home
That's
state.
like 6 years ago.
Yeah, it is pretty old.
Oh.
That's what, I was looking for better statistics.
In California, all the freaking cold medicines are freaking locked up.
Yeah, everything's locked up. Look at this, four in Arizona. You got
Those are meth labs?
meth labs that were busted.
There's
There's a
more.
meth lab within 2 miles of this campus.
You can smell it. It smells
It
like burnt
stinks.
plastic.
It does, it's nasty.
It smells like burnt
Burning
plastic.
rubber,
Yeah.
yeah. It's-
There's a bust at Pinon, like not too long ago, and me and my boyfriend go Pokemon hunting. Actually, a lot of us do in the community, and usually we just go in this huge circle, right? And we always pass by it. And Fernando,
Stinks.
yeah, like my boyfriend was like, "Oh yeah, these guys used to sell weed over here." I'm like, how do you know that? But now they upgraded and now they're selling meth apparently. And apparently we saw it. There's a helicopter for some reason, and it came down, and in here they raided the place, and then apparently everybody got taken.
It's good.
Hey,
So
you know that gas station when you're going towards Window Rock, right next to Navajo Pine, the market? They were getting ready for a freaking raid. And stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah, at U.S. Marshals, because it's tribal land, but there was no NNPD, it was all federal. FBI was there, U.S. Marshal, and I think state police was there.
Well, who's in charge of the law enforcement on the reservation? Who's in charge
I
of it?
guess it'd be FBI.
The FBI,
Yeah.
yeah, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
I wouldn't trust Navajo Nation. Please, honestly, right now.
It's crazy, like, when you don't need them, they're all over the place, but when you need them, they can never be freaking found.
I can never find them at all.
I've been stopped twice on the road going to Chimney.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And then they see my license, it says Bentonville, okay, we'll just go down. We're like 2 miles over.
Do you get stopped?
Yeah, I think they're just bored.
They just,
Got nothing to do.
yeah.
Treatment for amphetamine usage has skyrocketed in the past decade. In 1993, only 21,000 people sought treatment for amphetamine addiction. This figure had increased to 151,000 by 2004. Other stimulants also make an impact on our lives. Use of caffeine is in recent, caffeine, there you go. Good stuff.
Yeah, man.
In recent years has increased markedly. Coffee kiosks have sprung up in tiny towns, and sales of caffeinated soft drinks and energy drinks have exploded. There you go. And
Shoot, burn. I remember that. He said overseas.
18% of teens, 4,300,000, have used Vicodin in the form of hydrocodone in 2004. Hydrocodone is the most widely used and abused prescription opiate. 10% to 2,300,000 teens abused the opiate Percodan in the, see now I'm making thirsty. In the form of OxyContin, the time-release version of oxycodone. Alcohol directly kills 75,000 people in the United States every year. Alcohol directly kills 1.8 million people worldwide every year. 17.6 million Americans have an alcohol abuse problem. That is 8.5% of the adult population have an alcohol abuse problem. Alcoholics make up 10 to 15% of the people in hospitals. 10 to 20% of people in nursing homes are alcoholics, and that's the reason they're there. When MRIs were done on gamblers, the portions of the brain that were activated by winning and losing were the same areas that were activated by cocaine. Statistics show that 2.5 million Americans are classified as pathological gamblers. 3 million Americans are classified as problem gamblers. 15 million Americans are at risk for problem gambling. And of course, this is, anytime they have an advertisement for Sandia or Isoleta, they always say, please gamble responsibly.
Oh, they got signs in every casino. Gambling should be fun.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
One study in Minnesota in 2004 found that 1% of the gamblers accounted for 50% of the wagers. 1% of the gamblers accounted for 50% of the wagers. In the same year, among the riverboats of Illinois, 10% of the gamblers accounted for 80% of the revenues. That's a lot of money being spent. While gambling may be the most economically devastating behavioral addiction, there are others that are equally personally devastating: compulsive overeating, anorexia, bulimia, internet addiction, Facebook, I don't know, all the stuff that people do. There are sexual addictions, as weird as that sounds, excessive TV addiction. Of course, I just told you that I watch movies all weekend. Compulsive shopping and pornography addiction. Some individuals can't control themselves and they watch pornography all the time.
What's the difference between anorexia and bulimia?
Anorexia is, bulimia is where you vomit. You eat a lot and then you vomit it out. So you use vomiting or purging of one ilk or another, one kind or another to.
But you want the same result?
No, but anorexia, you just starve yourself to death. You just don't eat. Or you claim that you ate and you ate a bite of food.
What do you do, just drink water? Or what?
You don't, you die. You starve yourself to
Isn't
death.
that what Karen Carpenter did?
Karen Carpenter died of anorexia.
Dang, she had a nice voice too, man.
Yeah. Yep, long time ago. There we go, and we are done with that chapter. Yay! Let me take a look at chapter 2, see what's going on. I knew I was gonna get through this chapter, I'm so good. You know, if we had been able to get in our classroom, that's not right.
You know what's crazy is like they do these raids on these freaking meth labs,
Yeah,
but what's a week later there's another one right in this
Mhm.
place.
that's the way she goes.
Like you can't stop it, you know? Whether or not they get it in Pinon, on the res, should they go to freaking Phoenix, Flag, well, I don't know about Flag, but like Albuquerque, the biggest cities, you know, Tucson.
Sure, let's market our drugs. This is good economics. It's what we need to learn on the reservation. This chapter is about heredity, environments, and psychoactive substances. Psychoactive drugs are substances that directly affect the central nervous system. The method that a drug gets into the brain is called pharmacokinetics. Literally, the movement of the drug. We're going to talk about how they are absorbed into your system, how it's distributed throughout your system, how you metabolize it, and how you eliminate it. These are all really important. Metabolization, of course, takes place. If you drank a six-pack right now, how long would it take for that alcohol to get out of your system? How long would it take to metabolize that alcohol? And how long would it take to eliminate it? A bigger question would be if you smoked marijuana right now, how long would it take to get that stuff out of your system?
32 days.
Yeah,
Well, it depends how much you smoke, but usually.
and depending on how fat you are,
Really?
how much fat you have in your body. If you're skinny, you get rid of it fairly quickly because it's fat soluble. So it goes into your fat cells and it's stored in your fat cells for about 28 to 32 days.
So it's kind of just like eating food then. You kind of like store it like. up
Yeah,
there.
isn't that great? That's one of the reasons why people who smoke marijuana, they don't have any withdrawal symptoms. Well, it's still in their system, so they don't have withdrawal symptoms. Pharmacokinetics deals with the route of administration. How do you get it into your system? The speed that it gets into your brain. How fast does it get into your brain? The affinity for nerve cells and neurotransmitters. What is it working on? What neurotransmitters? When a psychoactive drug can get to its target in the central nervous system rapidly, the more addictive it tends to be. One of the most addictive substances known to man is tobacco, is nicotine, because it gets into your system very, very rapidly. Another one is crack cocaine. Inhaling, when a person smokes a psychoactive substance, it draws it in as a vapor, as with nitrous oxide, or inhaling an active chemical solvent, colloquially referred to as huffing. The drug enters the individual's lungs. The drug is rapidly absorbed through the capillary lining of the alveoli of the bronchi. The psychoactive substance travels through the body with the blood and is pumped to the brain and the tissues of the body and may reach the brain in as short as 7 to 10 seconds if you breathe it in. So anytime you smoke something, marijuana, tobacco, or take in a chemical through by huffing, then it can get into your system very, very rapidly. Inhaling is the most rapid method of getting a psychoactive substance into your system. And we will stop right here and start on more interesting stuff. I'll explain to you why these drugs give you such a quick high, or it takes it